especially with spring break starting tomorrow, is busy, that professors tend to give you all their projects due today before they send you out. So for that especially, I appreciate you coming. Second, I want to thank the Bilden family for their support of the Asia Forum talks that we've been doing. And of course, thank Andrea Gittleman for coming today to talk about her work as she's doing it. One of the wonderful things about this is that all of you go to the Holocaust Museum, right, as plebes, and it's often just, I realize, scratching the surface of their work and their displays. It doesn't give you that much time. The nice part today is to find out that the Holocaust Museum works not only on what we think of as the European Holocaust of World War II, but examples of mass atrocity, of genocide that are going on all around the world and even occurring now as we speak, working to prevent that and to shut it down and stop it. The other thing I thought was kind of neat looking at Dr. Gittleman's bio here is that this week the plebes had to pick their majors, and with all the pressure to go STEM and to avoid topic or avoid majors like political science or English or history, I noticed that she majored in political science and international studies at the University of Chicago, went on to do a law degree, went on to work in Mauritania in the Peace Corps, and to do amazing things around the world, including working on the border of Thailand and Burma at Simon-Skjodt, which, if you've ever been there, it's pretty much the edge of nowhere, if you want to imagine what the edge of nowhere looks like. So she's the program, or Andrea Gittleman is the program manager for the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Previously, she was interim director of U.S. policy and senior legislative counsel at the Physicians for Human Rights. She's been served as the Arthur Helton Global Human Rights Fellow with the Burma Lawyers Council. That's what she was doing in Thailand. She's also worked with New York University's Immigrants' Rights Clinic as a law student there. So I'll let her talk more about her ongoing work and any of her work that she's done in the past. If you guys are curious about what to do after the Navy, go to law school, go to Peace Corps, do all those things. So please join me in welcoming Andrea Gittleman.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be here with you today. It's a real honor for me to be here with you. So as you heard, I work with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you're all aware of the physical museum space and some of the things that we do. I work with the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. So as the name suggests, this is a center within the museum, so within an institution dedicated to memorializing the past, a very violent past, in a way that is respectful to survivors and to victims. But we have to do more than that. So we are the forward-looking institution that is part of a broader museum. So we look at ways to take the lessons from the Holocaust to make sure that never again can become a reality. So we look for communities at risk of persecution, of violence, places where minorities might be targeted because of their ethnicity, their religion, their race, and we try to do more research on these areas, speak out about what is happening, and in the end, generate policy responses from the United States government and others in order to prevent mass atrocities. So why does a museum about the Holocaust work on preventing and responding to genocide today? I think Elie Wiesel said it very well. He said a memorial unresponsive to the future would also violate the memory of the past. So instead of seeing our institution as looking backward and looking forward, the break between those two is quite artificial. We really try to do both, and it's essential that we do both. One without the other would ring hollow for a lot of visitors. So as our mandate, we try to alert the national conscience, we influence policymakers, stimulate worldwide action to confront and work to halt acts of genocide or related crimes against humanity. And this is quite a heavy mandate. This is really influenced by the work of the broader museum to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. So we do this in a number of ways. Preventing genocide is something that cannot be done by one government, by one group of people, as I'm sure you know. So I'll just go through some of the programs that we have used or we have highlighted that can generate this footing where atrocity prevention becomes more in the muscle memory of our government and others. So one is what we call our early warning project. So this is the first of its kind publicly available system that lists global risk assessments for genocide and other forms of mass atrocities. We draw upon 3 different scientific models in order to list the risk of a future state-led mass killing in every single country in the world. So we draw upon various historical models. A lot of political scientists have worked on this to look at what are the factors longitudinally that create the risk within a state for mass killing of civilians. We also look at aggregated expert forecasts here in the middle. When we look at the data, we look at the trends over history. Sometimes things can change very quickly. In Burundi, for example, as you may know, just in the past year, we've seen a great worsening of the political situation and a lot of targeted killings of people because of their political views and because of their ethnicity. So we want to make sure that our early warning system can also pick up on some of these less tangible or at least faster moving kinds of data points. And then we draw upon a lot of expert analysis to put this all together. So what does it mean when a country like Nigeria, for example, has a high risk of state-led mass killing? Who is leading that? What can be done in order to mitigate that risk? So here is just a quick photo of our heat map. So you can see some of the countries that are listed in red have the highest statistical risk of a future state-led mass killing. And then the countries in orange and yellow all the way down to blue. And the countries listed here might not be very surprising. You see Burma or Myanmar close to number 1. You have Sudan, Central African Republic. Other countries are listed quite high, and a lot of these countries are countries that have experienced armed conflict. They may have experienced mass atrocities in the past. So what we try to do with the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide is do deeper dives into some of these countries where there is a high future risk. So in order to prevent genocide and other mass atrocities from happening, we want to make sure that we are understanding the dynamics of that risk, who is driving the risk, how that group could be either lessened or the risk could be mitigated. So my colleague went to northern Iraq, to Kurdistan, to speak with members of ethnic minorities there, including Christians and Yazidis and Shalbak and Turkmen, to get a sense of the violence that they were facing by the Islamic State. So here you can see like the area is controlled by ISIS. Of course, it's never as clean as this. But looking at the Nineveh Plains region, which is this area here in northern Iraq, which used to be the heartland for Iraq's ethnic minority groups, now so many have been killed or have been forced to flee. And so we see the museum's role as a way to capture information from people being forced to flee, gather their stories, but also to get a sense of what is driving the risk. So we all know that Iraq is a country where there's military conflict. There have been violence targeting civilians, targeting ethnic minority groups by a number of actors here. And so we're looking at what the Islamic State is doing and trying to apply our legal definitions so we know what is happening. At the end of this report, we have the declaration on the part of the museum that the Islamic State is perpetrating crimes of genocide against the Yazidi, just based on their crimes and their statements and what they are trying to do to minorities in the area. Another trip we took, we called this a bearing witness trip, was to Burma. So Burma, also called Myanmar, is one of the highest at-risk countries. For the past 2 years, it has been number 1 on our early warning project system. And this is often driven by a military regime that has been in control of the country for decades. It's now changing a bit. and a long, long history of the persecution, the suppression of many different ethnic and religious minorities. So one Rohingya activist who we spoke to, I was there about a year ago, he said it quite succinctly. He said, "They want us all to go away." And he described the different kinds of persecution, different kinds of physical violence that members of the Rohingya community face just because they are a different ethnic group, because they're Muslim in a majority Buddhist country, and they're seen as others, as foreigners. So this is a picture here. This was taken in one of the camps where about 140,000 people were forced to flee their home after violence erupted in 2012. So we're looking at a sustained period of mass displacement of people just because of their religion and ethnicity. The perpetrators who launched these attacks in 2012, some were Rakhine Buddhists, so themselves a ethnic minority, if not a religious one, often aided by police or government actors in different ways. So the Rohingya were forced from their homes into camps like this. So we saw early warning signs of genocide just by speaking to these people who had been displaced and by speaking to policymakers in Yangon, speaking to civil society leaders, to journalists. When we pulled all of this information together, it created a situation that is so untenable, that so violated the rights of this minority group, that there will be sparks of mass violence in the future if this situation is not addressed soon. So one of the things that we saw, which I thought was very, very eerie, was the physical segregation of ethnic groups. So you can see here, these are Rohingya children, and they're behind barbed wire. And on the other side of that barbed wire were Rakhine people. So people of two different ethnic groups with this very obvious physical divide in between them. And something you can't see about this photo is the barbed wire didn't go all the way across the street. People could have passed around if they had wanted to, but there was this palpable fear of the other ethnic group. Rakhine didn't come in and Rohingya didn't go out. There was such fear that people of another ethnic group would attack them. So the barbed wire itself is, yes, a physical manifestation of the segregation, but also the segregation is there because of this very palpable fear between groups. This is a photo of a mosque. This was taken in the capital of Sittwe, which is in Rakhine State in the western part of the country. So it's a pretty big town. Used to be a lot of Buddhists and Muslims living there together. Now there are almost no Muslims in the area. This mosque came under attack in 2012. And something that I thought was very strange is that it's in the middle of town. You can't really see a lot that's around it, but there's a busy road, there are shops, and this is just this ever-present reminder of attacks on religion that have never been investigated. No one has been held accountable for that. This is in one of the camps. You can kind of see what the living conditions are like for people who had been displaced. The people who live in the camps have significant limitations on their ability to move anywhere, which means so much more than just the inability to move around. It means they can't go to a market, they can't go to a clinic, they can't go to, definitely not to higher education. Even though the university is actually quite close by, they still cannot go. And so this woman here with her young child and the baby, she said her children, especially the baby, had an obvious health condition, this obvious skin condition, and she didn't know what to do about it, but she said that there was no place she could go in order to get the health care necessary for her children. And that's just one story of many, many people who were artificially cut off from basic and necessary services. This photo here, I like to show it just not so much for the foreground, although the child with the goat, I also like that too. But in the background, you can see these barracks lined up and these latrines lined up. It's so crowded there that it's just a public health disaster. The humanitarian standards, you have about 2 or 3 times as many people using these latrines as are standard in humanitarian situations. And so there's sewage in the streets, conditions where kids are running around, where people get sick and then compounded with the inability to get medicine or to see a doctor, it just makes a worsening living situation for everybody there. So this is interesting, and this might take some explaining. So when we were there about a year ago, there was some controversy about Rohingya and the ability to vote. So Rohingya, they're a minority in the country. They had never been accepted as citizens because of their status as minorities, but they had always been allowed to vote in elections for a number of different reasons. But for this past election in early 2015, some Rakhine people, the Rakhine Buddhists who also lived in this town, said that Rohingya should not be able to vote, that they're Muslims, they're foreigners, even though many had lived in Burma for decades, they should not be able to vote. And they launched protests marching in the street, and they created these signs that you see here on this shop. And this sign was on every single shop and every single house. And it was odd because white card is in English, and then there's text in Burmese that I didn't read. And so I asked our translator to translate it for us, and she said that this is saying that white card holders, basically that they shouldn't be able to vote, that they were protesting the decision by Parliament to allow Rohingya people to vote. And in response to this, the Parliament decided that no Rohingya will not be able to vote, even though they have voted in every past election. So an entire ethnic group, an entire religious group was then banned from voting, disenfranchised, just because of their identity. And the election went on in November of last year without Rohingya voting, and now there are no Muslim members of parliament in Burma at all, where there had been in the past, and there had been at least 3 different Rohingya members of parliament as well. So this is someone showing us his white card. So these are the cards that Rohingya had, and you can see at the bottom it's written in Burmese, but it says race/ethnicity, and it says Bengali/Islam. So the term that the government of Burma uses for Rohingya is to call them Bengali, to say they are from another country, they are not from Burma, and that kind of fuels all of the other discriminatory practices against them. Well, they shouldn't be able to go to university because they're foreigners, or they shouldn't be able to vote in the election because they're foreigners. The Rohingya themselves do not accept this term. They say they are not from Bangladesh and in fact have been in Burma for decades. And this man showed us the identity cards for his parents, so about 30 decades ago, and there was no mention of race or ethnicity on those identity cards. And it was very interesting to see when and how the government became interested in knowing about people's religious identity and ethnic identity. It's not something that's always important, but now all of a sudden for the Rohingya community, it was something that the government had to know. You might have heard about a year ago, there was increased migration, increased flight from Burma. All of these, the lack of movement, lack of humanitarian assistance, inability to participate publicly, inability to go and work and provide for your family, all of those combine together to make a lifestyle that is very, very unsustainable. So many people, especially young people, would try to flee by boat in order to go to Thailand and then to Malaysia. And this was really their only way out. The boat trips are extremely dangerous. The Rohingya know that before they embark, but they really feel like they have no other choice. They go to places like Thailand, hopefully to get to Malaysia, but are often intercepted by traffickers or smugglers, sometimes held for ransom, forced to call their families back home and demand more money. Some of those whom are trafficked or smuggled are later killed if they cannot provide additional funds. And even if they get to a place like Malaysia, they might end up in a detention center or living undocumented lives where they can't get jobs, and life is still not exactly what they hoped it would be. So I think if we take a step back and we look at what is happening in Burma today, it is still a case for prevention. With all of this violence and all of this persecution going on, we see all of these elements, all of these ingredients that could lead to genocide in the future. But it doesn't necessarily need to lead to that. There can be strong leadership. As you might know, there's been an election, and the democratic opposition led by Aung San Suu Kyi, that party is now in power. And there are now a lot of expectations on her specifically and on her party to take this situation more seriously and to start address the rights of Rohingya. And this will be a very, very long process. It is not popular in the country. Most ordinary people in Burma, no matter their religion or their ethnicity, don't really like the Rohingya themselves. So sometimes it's not politically savvy to speak out on behalf of this minority group. But there is a lot of pressure for them to do something. So there are small movements now. People are talking about increased aid. People are talking about maybe lessening some of the restrictions on movement that hopefully will make a lasting change for the Rohingya people. I think it begs a bigger question, not only about Burma, but about how we do this work, preventing mass atrocities everywhere, about how you bring together communities who don't like each other, who really fear each other, who have been told dangerous things about their neighbors, about other communities. How do you bridge that? And how do we rebuild trust in such broken spaces? And those are really, really difficult questions. I know that we at the museum cannot answer them. The US government cannot answer them. A lot of this has to happen on a very local level, and that takes years and decades to do. But that's really how we come to genocide prevention in the future. So I will just end it there, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have about the museum's work, our atrocity prevention work, or any specific questions you may have on our case study of Burma. Thank you.
One of the things I thought was interesting is Dr. Gittleman is a lawyer. She has a Juris Doctor, doctorate of law. And what I found curious here was you have a situation where I wondered whether there was a legal basis in Burma, within Burma, for what they're doing. So on one hand, are they legally justifying this by saying these are illegal immigrants so that we can put them in a concentration camp? On the other hand, is that a legal argument undermined by the idea that these outsiders had been allowed to vote in past elections? So on one hand, I wonder about internal law or internal logic with the law. And the other question has to do with international law. That is there an aspect of international law that would say you can't do this to not only your own citizens or anyone else's citizens, no matter how they ended up here?
Exactly. So I can speak about local law first. So something that's always brought up is in the Burma has had a number of different constitutions. In the 1974 constitution, there was a listing of all ethnic groups in Burma, and they listed 135, which is very arbitrary. Rohingya are not on there. Some are just made up. I mean, and also, who does that? It's not the role of a constitution to write down the list of every ethnic group that is considered to be part of the Union of Burma. So that's problematic right there. It does not adhere to international legal standards. But that's what a lot of current policymakers in Burma look to. They'll say, look, the Rohingya are not on this list. They are foreigners. They cannot be here. Kind of ignoring all the problems about that process. That has then become this, this foundation upon which other laws can then discriminate against the Rohingya. So there's a 1982 citizenship law that establishes different classes of citizenship based on that list of 135 ethnic groups. And because Rohingya are not in the group, well, then they can't have citizenship. And so when you speak to policymakers in Burma, they say that same thing, and they say they're not on the list, so therefore they can't get into this law. And it gets a little bit circular. And so those are the laws that were purposely designed to exclude people that then allow the promulgation of other laws that do that same thing. So if you were to ask them, they would say, this is our legal reasoning behind this. They cannot vote because they're not citizens. They're not citizens because they weren't included in this list. And you know, for them, it is quite logical. You know, they follow those steps. If you look to international law, I mean, just if you look at customary international law, there is the right to self-determination. So if the Rohingya say they are Rohingya, full stop. People can say they're anything that they want to be, And it's not the right of anyone else, certainly not of a government, to say, no, that ethnic group doesn't exist. No, that's not your name. No, you are something else. And then there are other serious laws being broken and other humanitarian standards being broken. When you get to the physical segregation of people based on their ethnicity, you get to the denial of humanitarian assistance just based on ethnic group. There are a lot of groups, like Doctors Without Borders, for example, and a lot of groups that can provide life-saving services. And the state government, really the national government in Burma, is purposely keeping those caregivers from the Rohingya just based on their ethnicity. And there is absolutely no legal reason for that. Certainly no rationale, and it's completely violating international legal standards. Yes.
Ma'am, do you have an example of prevention, genocide prevention that worked?
Yes.
And how that happened?
Yes. So that is a perfect question. It is a very difficult question. It's often difficult to know if prevention works or doesn't work, because we can look at our intervention in a certain situation and then we'll say, oh, genocide didn't happen, so we prevented it, but maybe it wasn't going to happen anyway. It gets a little bit difficult to measure. I think some of the cases we look at, especially from the US government, they often look at Central African Republic recently as a case where there was serious diplomatic heft brought in, and there were killings, and there was a lot of violence, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been, mostly because of pressure from the United States. There was a visit by the Pope, actually. The Pope visited Muslim communities, and that bridged divides that had been violent for so long. And they recently had peaceful elections, and of course there's always a threat of violence there. It's hard to call it a case of total prevention when so many people had already been killed, but a case where strong diplomatic efforts had at least lessened the tension and had prevented even more people from being killed. So there are situations like that. I think you can look at a lot of cases that are currently areas of conflict and still look at how prevention can play a role. Like for Iraq, for example, it's hard to call that a case of prevention. So many people have been killed. But looking at what is happening when areas are liberated by ISIS, for example, and looking at returns of people and potential attacks against Sunni Muslims who were not killed under ISIS. So there's now this new dynamic and a new community of people that could be under threat again. So there's still this imperative for prevention, even in a case where there has already been so much death. Yes?
I'm curious to know what the international community, especially in the situation areas doing in Burma, that situation. I know there's a lot of Islamic countries there, so are they looking out for their own, or what's exactly going on?
Yeah, that is a great question. That is pretty complicated too. So a lot of governments have some serious interest in Burma, mostly investment interests. There was about a year or two ago some assistance that was going to be provided by the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, very concerned about what was happening with Rohingyas because they're a Muslim, and I think that was something that the government of Burma saw as a threat and purposely did not want to have that kind of assistance. And now the OIC has more of a strained relationship with Burma, even though they really were just trying to offer this kind of assistance. Saudi Arabia also tried to give assistance to people displaced in the camps, but they came in with like their flags and their name on everything, and that didn't go over very well either. And of course that kind of fizzled out. People, I think, saw that that wasn't going to be very helpful. About a year ago, with what we call the boat crisis, but that's just shorthand. People have been fleeing and risking their lives for so long, year after year. They tend to go more when sailing is easier. So starting pretty soon. It's started to become a regional issue. Southeast Asia itself tends to allow the internal affairs of other countries rest with those other countries. there isn't this strong culture, and Professor, please correct me if I'm wrong, of really trying to cooperate with another country in order to promote human rights within the country. But with the increased number of people fleeing by boat and people coming to Thailand and coming to Malaysia, some even coming to Indonesia, it was becoming a regional issue. So there were some meetings where people were saying, I know, Thailand, you don't want to deal with Rohingya in Burma, but this is it's now affecting you, it's now affecting others in the region. There needs to be some kind of regional response. And really what came out of that, some countries, I know the Philippines said that they would accept a certain number of refugees, but there was really no willingness to address the root causes of the issue. No country was willing to say, government of Burma, you need to make some changes to keep people from fleeing. You need to make life more livable for minorities in your country. That was a little bit too far. Is that accurate? Oh.
Ma'am, on the slide that showed the map of countries with increased risk of state-sponsored violence, India was listed as having a high risk.
Yes.
I understand that because of the history of ethnic violence, there's always the risk of non-state-sponsored ethnic violence.
Uh-huh.
But could you go into what the Holocaust Museum sees as the risk for actual state-sponsored ethnic violence?
Yes. So I don't have the country profiles in front of me, but it's true, the map I showed you does look at only the likelihood of state-sponsored mass killing, and mass killing that we define as killing of 1,000 or more civilians, so truly mass killing of people. We look at different things, including how long a government has been in power, whether there are what we call elite threats to that government, so whether there are strong political parties jockeying for power. We look at things like GDP, things like infant mortality. We look at very longitudinal data, things that don't really change so much over time. We look at coups and coup threats. A lot of it is about the architecture of the government and how it has been set up. We also look at whether there have been past state killings of civilians, and that's something that certainly influences the risk of a new state mass killing. If you go to earlywarningproject.com, you can click on each country, and it'll tell you which of those elements is driving the risk in each particular country. Yes?
Is the early warning project based on statistics or sort of analysis of people's money?
That's a good question. We try to make it a marriage of both. So we have our statistical risk assessment that leads to that map that I showed you, and that's all statistics, and that's all publicly available data on purpose. We don't want the government of Cameroon to say, no, you don't understand what's happening here. Those numbers are wrong. Our data is open to everyone, and we don't use any secret intelligence or anything like that. So very transparent in what we do and the kinds of statistics that we use. But that's only one side of the story, and that's only looking at state-led mass killing and only looking over time. I mean, the government type, whether there's been a coup, GDP, those are things that take years to change usually. It's not something that from January to February we might see a really marked shift. So we look at what we call our opinion pool. So we do speak to people, try to speak with experts within the country who can say, the risk wasn't very high in January, but now in March, things are getting really bad. The police are going around and arresting people. People are becoming disappeared. And they'll tell us that the risk is rising. And that's information that the statistics can't really capture. Maybe they would capture it a year or two in the future. But when we want to have an early warning system that leads to effective early responses, we need to also capture that more nimble, that quicker data. So we try to get that information as well. And so we have an opinion pool where people can kind of estimate the amount of risk in a particular situation, and they can move little toggles around and say there is a 20% risk in this situation. It also allows us to be more flexible and get away from some of our statistics and ask about the risk of non-state actors committing atrocities. There isn't a lot of data on non-state actors. It's hard to know GDP of ISIS-controlled areas. I mean, people aren't collecting this kind of information. You can't really compare it to other non-state groups. So moving into what people are seeing and getting this softer kind of data is something that will supplement the more statistical, the more rigorous side of the project.